You might feel a little bit confused about what notches are since you've probably seen them being used in two completely separate scenarios. One type of notching refers to notch extensions added to seam edges, which later helps match these edges in the seam alignment process. These notches are transferred from pattern to fabric and are extremely important in the sewing process. The second type of notching, which I'll show you today, refers to adding slash or triangular cuts into the seam allowance of curved seams to prevent tension and strain in the final seam. These tension release notches are not displayed on your sewing patterns. You will be the one making the decision as to where and how many to add along each seam. The general rule is the more curved the seam allowance is, the more notches you will need for tension release. Notching seam allowance means cutting triangle-shaped wedges or simply slashing close to the seam line to release tension and allow curved seams to lay flat. Notches may cause a bit of confusion for sewing beginners since there are two different types of notches used in dressmaking. One type provides seam allowance markers used to match corresponding seam edges to one another. On the other hand, the tension release notching discussed in today's tutorial is a collection of snips or triangle-shaped cuts that are applied to the seam allowance of curved seams to release tension. They are also used to prevent fit and strain issues within the garment's other seams and finished edges. In terms of tension release notches, there are two separate styles you should be familiar with: triangle cut or wedge notches and plain slashes. These two notching types are interchanged based on whether the curve is facing inward or outward. This method is a simple slashing of the seam allowance, starting from the edge and ending close to the stitch line. It is mostly used on inward curves. These simple clips allow the slits to spread apart, thus allowing the notched edge to mold and adjust to its corresponding seam edge. As opposed to simple slashes, these notches are cut in a triangular or wedge shape. They are mainly used on the seam allowance of outward-facing curves to provide both flexibility and a way to remove excess that prevents curved seams from laying flat. The wedge cutouts draw in the seam allowance to remove unnecessary bulk. If outward curves are not notched with triangular cuts, the seam allowance excess will gather together and create extra bulk and puckering in the finished seam. There are two main instances when notching the seam allowance is needed in the construction process: to aid in the process of matching unlike curves when seam edges are aligned. Notching the seam allowance is done on individual edges prior to the seam being aligned and stitched. In this case, stay stitching is used to first reinforce the fabric edge prior to notching it. Stay stitching is a stabilizing straight stitch which maintains the strength and structure of the notched seam edge. The second instance is when releasing tension in curved seams and enclosed edges after the seam has been stitched. In this instance, the notches are applied to seams formed from identical curved edges that are easy to align, pin, and machine stitch. Notching is applied to both seam allowance layers to release strain and tension in the finished seam or enclosed edge. The best example of notching seam allowance for tension release is when sewing face necklines and armholes.